We'll start out here.
Go ahead, keep going.
We'll start out here with a picture of the train leaving Minneapolis, just getting on the main line after leaving Minneapolis Junction, with 3 appear to be nicely shined up GP20s that would have replaced 4 F units on an equal horsepower equivalent basis. This picture came from an ad put out by EMD and a number of real industry publications at the time. Judging from the kind of power being used and the time of day, I'm quite sure this was second 401, later numbered as 83, but at least at this time, second 401 leaving Union Yard, I believe at 10 or 10:30 a.m. So we're heading toward Wilmer and Breckenridge. Breckenridge is as far as we will go today with this show. So here's what I hope to cover informally today, these general topics here. Characteristics of the line, which will include some comparison with the line that became known as the preferred line, that is the NP line between Minneapolis and Castleton, and see how things have evolved over the years since the 50 years since the merger, in the use and the condition and standards and whatever for both lines, both the NP and GN. I'll cover a few anecdotes. The people side of railroading is the most fun to recall. So we'll cover a few of those examples or anecdotes today. We'll talk about what's evolved since the changeover after the merger in terms of traffic density. And then I think most of us like to have a look at what other people have collected as photos. Many of these will be common knowledge to probably almost everybody on here, but hopefully there might be a couple that will strike your interest as well. Well, as I'd like to do in presentations is give some credit to people who have had some support given over the years, just very recently in making this presentation or preparing it, in other cases going back to the beginning of my involvement in railroading about 50 years ago. So the first name, Amy Jo Stockinger, she's a professional graphic arts person in Fargo who I like to use for putting together the artistic part, if you will, the technical parts, which is almost everything because I can't handle. Credit to John Langlot for giving me a call, asking me if I'd make the presentation, which I was very glad of. And then next, Bob Kelly and Don McLaughlin. Don is sitting right next to me this morning as a backup, so we won't have any technical glitches that I might cause. Then Bob Kelly was over at our house a couple of times in the last few weeks to get me acquainted at least on what Zoom was all about. Mona Nelson, probably many of you remember as being the director of the Candy Yohai Museum, as a wonderful person of being able to know what railroad history she had on hand and good at sharing it and interpreting it. And if she didn't have what you wanted, she often knew who did. You know, farmer employees living in town or elsewhere, for example. Gary Nelson, well known to everyone, a conductor who started at Wilbur on the Great Northern, and then after merger having to move to Minneapolis and work on the BN and BNSF. We'll cover some details under the anecdotal parts of the program. Mr. Oviatt was superintendent in the early 1960s at Wilbur when I first started out, and all of us have to give some credit to excuse me, those who helped us out in our early stage to you know, not just let the yard master or the dispatcher kick you out of the office, but Mr. Oviatt would help open doors for people like myself to learn railroading, decide if you wanted to work there or for schoolwork or whatever. We all respect Norm Freeby for all the knowledge and the collections that he has on GN history And you'll certainly see some work that Norm has helped me out on when we get to, especially the Sioux City line a little bit later. Red Conway was a Great Northern trainmaster at Wilmer in my early days. The Conway family, of course, is famous in Wilmer, well established. Many, many Conways worked for the railroad. Tom Cottner started as a fireman, an engineer, and a laborer in the shops in St. Paul. Became an engineer and rose to become assistant chief mechanical officer of BN. We'll talk about Tom's work with other activities in that a little later. David Plowden, many of you are familiar with, a wonderful photographer. And at one time, he was a Great Northern employee as a student officer with the official title of, excuse me, assistant to the trainmaster at Wilmer. Mark Jeffrey, project engineer. Those of you who participated in the events last weekend, I wasn't there, but I noticed that you probably took a look at the Wilmer Y project that Mark is in charge of. And Gene Johnson, I'm mentioning, is a brakeman I knew in my early days. And in order to get established with railroading, why, he said, you got to have a watch. And he sold me his Hamilton Railway Special, which still works. So I couldn't leave his name off here. So we'll move ahead. Excuse me. What were the standards of the Great Northern Wilmer Division line between Minneapolis and Breckenridge in the 1960s, leading up toward the eventual merger? Well, probably everybody watching here is familiar with speed restrictions. There's a general restrictions of 79 and 60 mph. And then fortunately, this line had very few permanent speed restrictions in this case, due to apparently to agreements or legislation requiring reduced speed through these three communities listed of Wayzata, Benson, and Morris. This is all I could find in going through the track chart and alignment chart for the Great Northern in the 1960s, and talking to a couple of operating employees. They could not recall anything further than this. So these are the only permanent ones. Of course, Wilmer, I did not put on it because all the trains stopped there for crew change, as we know. The line was being relayed with 115-pound continuous welded rail to replace 112-pound jointed rail at that time, which became a standard, of course, across the entire system before the merger, when it was changed to 132 on the high tonnage lines. CTC was in service at the time from the end of double track at Wayzata through to Breckenridge, installed in the 1950s, which was a major change, of course, not needing operators at stations, at intermediate stations along the way any longer. Double track automatic block signal system signaled for traffic in both directions, which was not altogether common. Most ABS on double track was for one direction only. In the case of the Great Northern, they put it in between Minneapolis and Wayzata, as well as other places. Two main track CTC was put in. The track was rationalized with the installation of CTC. And in some cases, it was a reduction of double track ABS that had been in service, but with CTC, at least the analysis showed double track could be reduced to two main tracks if CTC were put in. And that was done. Curvature, this is just about an operating man's dream here, having maximum of 2 degrees, except for one curve, which was only a 3-degree curve, very close to the stop at Breckenridge. And the distance between Minneapolis passenger station and the crossing of the two lines, that is Great Northern and NP main lines at Castleton, was 261 miles. I can't remember if it was 262 or 260, but 1 mile difference anyway for the NP, as I remember. And keep in mind now, this mileage that I've shown here, this is not going by way of Fargo where the passenger trains went. This is for the diagonal line across southeast North Dakota by way of Kindred, which was freight only, and only priority freight trains moving between Breckenridge and Minot that would not have any work to do at Fargo. And the line has the line between Minneapolis and Breckenridge is a maximum grade of 0.4%. Now, I remember I said now Minneapolis, if I had said St. Paul, that wouldn't be true because you have a grade of about 1.6% coming right out of the old Union Station in St. Paul. But I'm talking about the freight operation starting at Minneapolis Junction or Union Yard is 0.4. Anyhow, this is an example of Mr. Hill taking a personal interest in giving very direct, clear direction to his engineers about rebuilding or reconfiguring the grades and the embankments and the fills and the cuts and so on after he took over the old St. Paul and Pacific. And in the Hill Library, probably some of you have seen the same file here, but it's a series of, I believe, about 7 or 8 handwritten pages. I'm not sure if that actually is Hill's handwriting or if he had someone else do it, but in any event, that's how the standard in very great detail is communicated by him over his signature to his engineering force to get it down to 0.4. That's why if you're driving along Highway 12, you will see some very high embankments someplace, and that's a result of directions given in this letter to take the sags out and to get the grades down from 0.6 or 0.8, which there were several locations at the time that Mr. Hill took over. So next, we'll talk a little bit about the NP by comparison to say, how did it happen that it became the preferred route between Minneapolis and Castleton, where the lines cross, rather than the Great Northern Line by way of Wilmer and Breckenridge. And just in the lower part of the smaller print, you notice that the NP had been built with almost all double track ABS, which has a higher capacity than the GN's single track, even with CTC. But still 31 miles of the NP between milepost 103 and 134 remained at single track CTC. So it wasn't a totally double track railroad, but it still was largely double track, which has much more capacity, of course. Plus, I had a favorable location with the junction at Staples to the line going to Duluth, which became very desirable once the coal began to move in large quantities to the rail to water transfer facilities in Superior. Looking at the track chart for the NP in the late 1960s, and talking with NP people who couldn't come up with more than 2 restrictions on speed through communities. One at Little Falls, which of course included crossing the Mississippi River on a single track bridge, and through Detroit Lakes. And then this next note probably isn't too clear, so I'll explain it. Between East Gilworth, their yard near Moorhead, and Castleton, you have a mixture of 35 and 40 miles an hour going through Fargo and Moorhead and West Fargo. So it's not a 60 mile an hour railroad even today, of course, and was not at the time the decision was still made. We will designate the NP as the preferred route between Minneapolis and Castleton, where we will then put in a connection to the Surrey cutoff by way of New Rockford to move on out west. Now, to its credit, the BNSF has done a lot of work on what they call the Staples subdivision, and as well as the KO subdivision, which is the line between Dilworth, Castleton, and Minot. Again, this is under the merged operation. KO stands for was the old telegraph call for New Rockford. It's not knockout Fargo like we used to think of it when I was growing up. But anyway, anybody looking for some detail about the great amount of improvement made under the so-called preferred route between Minneapolis and Castleton and on up to Minot would find perusing through a timetable of today's Twin Cities division of interest. Here we have profiles taken out of employee timetables for the Great Northern, showing the difference between the somewhat parallel lines between St. Paul, running west from St. Paul in the direction of the Minnesota-Dakota state line. As we mentioned on the top one, we won't go through this in any detail, but it's easy to take a look and find that at 0.4% grade, the only exception being this little piece here at Hancock, which I think Norm Peewee may either have or will be covering in his presentation. I would think where that used to be a short piece of double track and was taken off sometime before my time. The lower profile being the line by way of St. Cloud and Alexandria to Fargo. Still a very good piece of road, but has a lot more curvature, and it has several short sections of 0.6% grade, so not quite as good as Mr. Hill set out, establishing the standard of 0.4 for the Wilmer line. And then here's just a little more detail showing the same thing between the same profile, but just blowing it up a little bit between actually all the way to St. Paul with as heavy grade as that I mentioned for passenger trains. But then if you start looking at Minneapolis Junction and Lindale Junction on there, they're looking west toward Wilmer, you see what how well engineered and well designed the alignment and the grades are on that line. Wilmer to Breckenridge, just about an ideal situation, light curvature, small amount of grades, and just an ideal operating situation. It's hard to get any better than that anywhere. Well, going back again to start out on what I designated as the main line, here we have a view of Union Yard in Minneapolis from the west end of Yard C, and then behind us another mile and a half or so is Minneapolis Junction, where freight trains like the GN train there will be getting to finally be out of this yard complex and able to widen out the throttle. I'm not positive, but I think this train here probably is number 405 for train for Grand Forks and or Crookston and Winnipeg, just by the time of day and the kind of power. And it's interesting to see the so-called Redbirds of the Burlington being held until 405 or whatever number the GN train is to get out of town. And at that point, the Redbirds will then head east to Dayton's Bluff to their yard, where interchange hold off of numbers 488 and 82 will be put together in trains for Chicago and Galesburg, Illinois. So this slide here is just what I just said. I guess I wouldn't have had to talk so much because I just let you read it, but it's nothing different. It's the same thing. Okay, then moving west a little bit from the Twin Cities, we come to Lake Minnetonka, which is to the south, adjacent to the track going through Wayzata. Then you notice the junction there at the top right, the line to the north, northwest, the main line, going toward Romer, the line to the southwest, the old Hutchinson Branch, commonly called the Hutch, which was shut down and sold to a short line operator after the deregulation provisions came into effect. And then not too much later, the short line operator shut down also. Anyhow, the timetable from 1922. So we'll talk about this just as a snapshot of what the Hutch line amounted to, and it's, say it in its best days, perhaps in 1992 on a snapshot basis. One daily round trip between St. Paul and Hutchinson, and 4 daily round trips between Minneapolis and Mound. Now, I don't know exactly when it was that the Great Northern discontinued running trains and used its influence by ownership or majority ownership of Greyhound at that time to substitute a suburban service by bus. I presume that happened in Ralph Budd's time, since he was big on developing Greyhound service to substitute for lightly used passenger trains on branch lines throughout Minnesota and North Dakota. And so I think it probably maybe in the 30s, I suppose, but I'd be interested to find out sometime. Anyway, later on, the even the Greyhound shut down, and all of the metropolitan bus service in Minneapolis and St. Paul and suburban areas was taken over by a new government agency. This picture, another just phase of some interesting features of the Minneapolis-Wilmer line was construction of this a European castle known as the Lafayette Club. It was by Mr. Hill, in which he tried to attract wealthy European visitors. And this was at the time before there was good access to Glacier Park, where they really put their emphasis of the Great Northern. But anyhow, in the earlier days of it, you had people from Eastern United States or southern part of the country or Europe who wanted to get away from the heat in the summer. Supposedly you could come to this lodge on Lake Minnetonka in the vicinity of very close to Wayzata. You can see the train service right in front of the hotel. Hotel burned down the second time in 1922 and wasn't replaced according to what I read. This is the type of, going back to Greyhound again, this is the type of bus that I remember seeing at the Minneapolis Greyhound Depot when they make announcements for people to use as suburban service, not the same type of bus used for intercity service, more like just a city bus. And as I said, Great Northern had a controlling interest in Northland Greyhound, one of the divisions of the Greyhound Corporation at that time. So they could give direction that had to be complied with for such a new service. This picture came from Gary Nelson's collection. I assume this was in the times yet when even after the commuter trains on the Hutch line were taken off, where they still had this old combination baggage and coach that was on the trains for people who wanted to ride or to handle package freight, LCL, and so on, and that you did not have to go to Lyndale Junction Yard to get on it. You could get on at the Minneapolis Depot, and I don't know just when that was stopped. Obviously, it was still in effect when the dieselization first came about. Wayzata today, we've got 2 slides here to show the reduction from double track to single track through Wayzata. The depot is just over our right shoulder as we face this picture. Anyhow, as I said, we're down to single track there now, and the railroad company worked cooperatively with the development people in Wayzata who wanted to get more of an upscale recreational area and business area in Wayzata. And for those of you who are familiar there, that the dock, I believe, is the one that was built for people who wanted to tie up their boat while they go into what we used to know as Hart's Cafe, where we had a good view of both the railroad and the lake. It's now called, last time I was there, it was called Sunset, but it may be called something else now. Anyhow, a nice walkway built here also. So it's the depot is about the center, upper center of the picture. There's the railroad depot. It's a very attractive location, one to just take a stroll on. Hopes that a train might come by, but just to enjoy the general ambience of the very Wayzata, a very nice community together with the Lake Minnetonka. This development was called Panelway. I'd never heard that word before, but looked it up and found it was derived from the word panorama. That's where it comes from. That was what the promoters of the city of Wayzata used to justify this partnership in the landscaping and the fence and making Wayzata even more desirable area. So we'll get past that now and move to Wilmer. This, of course, picture is present day. This isn't going back to Great Northern history here, but it's from my standpoint, it's nice because the yard is so clean. You know, there's no weeds, no trash, a couple of very small piles of some kind of bulk material that leaked out of a car the way it looks, but still not a hazard or anything too obnoxious. But anyhow, a clean, safe place to work. It looks respectable. And you have to hand it to the new management to keeping this yard looking. This yard and most all other yards that I've seen in recent years looking as good as it did in the Great Northern days. Making clean, absence of weeds, trash, junk. Something you can take some pride in instead of being a disgrace. Well, then back to moving beyond Wilmer is a common picture many of you have seen. Hancock of a local, looks like it has a coach ahead of the caboose, just coming into Hancock and stopping so the conductor can go in the depot and visit with the agent and get his instructions on what's to be moved. 2 livestock cars parked at I presume was a small stockyard over on the left side. I kind of like 2 in the lower right-hand corner. The wheelbarrow that the young boy is sitting in and just watching all of the action before he gets on with his task of moving the wheelbarrow over to the neighbors or back home or whatever. It's typical Americana. Talking about the line between Wilmer and Breckenridge, someone who may have seen this this book called A Time of Bells and Whistles was written or compiled by a man, his last name was Broberg. I can't remember his first name, but he was the son of an engineer who worked in the steam days between Wilmer and Breckenridge. If you want to read a book that's just about the life of crews, away from home terminals and the kind of things that were on their mind as they took their calls and ran whatever they were called for. It's an interesting book compiled and sold by the Canada Ohio County Historical Society. Good story about life, real life on the railroad in the steam days, probably going back in the 30s. So we can assume that this is a mainline local here. Probably this picture is not actually on the Wilmer division. I'll have to admit it's at Epping, North Dakota. But anyhow, still kind of gives you the flavor of what could be a mainline local, even though it does have 2 GP9 units. It may not really have been, but we'll just pretend that it's local on the way back now after doing work at Hancock and the other stations. And whatever, if you assume it's on a turnaround basis and on the way back to their origin point, they might be on short time and having to work cooperatively with the dispatcher to get in before the 16-hour limit is up and they have to bring another crew out. Or also be as cooperative as they can be to do that and still not delay a higher priority train, just typical all in a day's work. I don't know what kind of local service they have now. Last I heard was a turnaround between Wilmer and Doran, but I don't know if they run that far other than during the harvest season. Take a look at this drawing here. Very simple. If you look at the horizontal line just above the middle of the page, that's supposed to be the NP main line between Jamestown and Fargo and Dilworth. And then in the lower right, you see to Wilmer. And then the freight only line I talked about a while ago by way of Kindred to Castleton, and then crossing over the NP and going on to Minot. Now, one thing in the merger planning that I found a little surprising was that they did not seem to assume there'd be much growth in traffic. And of course, as we know, the growth in traffic since 1970 has been phenomenal in this area, as well as much of the rest of the BN system. But in any event, if rather than sell the line by way of Kindred to a short, or sell or lease to the line to a short line operator and take the automatic block signal system out, I think I'd say on my road, I would have kept that line as an alternate route for the days in which Dilworth is going to be so jammed that you can't get trains east of West Fargo without having to hold them back and stop at Nave and hold them back on the KO subdivision at Nolan or south of there. So anyway, I believe the BN has retained trackage rights on the line I'm talking about between Wahpeton Junction and Castleton, but the railroad is not used by other than the short line Red River Valley and Western, as far as I know. Anyhow, as I said, having that alternate route, once the coal business boomed and the ethanol business came along and all the containers from the West Coast came along, it would have been desirable to have this alternate route to avoid all this congestion that sometimes happens. Now, this may not be anywhere near as bad as it was because the coal is way down and it seems to be going into termination in the next several years. So maybe the problem is back to it simply isn't a problem because that business, while it's good while it lasted, it's like many things in life. Good things eventually go to an end. Anyway, that was not kept in as an alternate route. There, that just covers what I just said earlier. Well, going to Breckenridge, some of you may have seen this monument, which I have not actually seen, but I understand it's very close to the caboose that is on the station grounds of the old depot at Breckenridge. It's now the office building for the short line. And the printing on the left is what it says on that monument. That this was Hill's objective, and his predecessors for that matter. The objective was build to Breckenridge to the Red River, because at that point we can then use transportation on the Red River to establish a trade corridor into Canada. Now, related to that is this monument, which is not on the road and not funded by the road as far as I know. But in any event, it's a monument to show the headwaters of the Red River where the Otter Tail and the Sioux rivers merge and then flow north. So even though you can't imagine nowadays that anybody could have commercial shipping on the Red River at any location, why in the old days where they had shallow draft, and it was a more efficient way than ox carts to get freight into Canada. And it was good enough that even the Canadian Pacific's first steam locomotive at Winnipeg, I've read, was put on a barge at this location and put up to at least the border, and then became or went into service on the CP and known as the Countess of Dufferin. So when the railroad was built through to Canada, that was the end of, as far as I know, commercial navigation on the Red River. But at least this was an important point for the local historians in the Wahpeton Breckenridge area. Another landmark you may be familiar with, burned down a number of years ago, the old Stratford Hotel in Breckenridge, where the railroad crews stayed. Gary Nelson told me that the Great Northern Chain Gang crews had been moved out of this hotel before it burned, fortunately. But unfortunately, Amtrak had an engineer who was lodged there who died in the fire. And in a news article I read, there was another maintenance employee who was defined as of the railroad, was in the hotel, but got out, was rescued by the fire department. But my chief remembrance of this was my mother and I during the war. When I say the war, I mean World War II was going on. We came over to Breckenridge to ride the Empire Builder out west, where she had relatives working in the shipyards during the war. And anyhow, we stayed in this hotel. And the only thing I can remember about the hotel as a 4 or 5-year-old was all the smell of combination of tobacco and snus and men's sweat. And it was not the place for anybody else to stay, really. But anyhow, that structure's gone. I don't know if anything was ever built in this place or not. Talking about that trip my mother and I made on the Empire Builder, we lived in Fergus Falls, and in order to get a nonstop train, we have to change out west way. She said, we're going to take the local Elliott Bus Company over to Breckenridge, stay overnight in the hotel, and get on the train the next day. And this picture was not in Breckenridge, as you can see, it's Fargo. But anyhow, I wanted to get this locomotive because the only thing I remember about that trip in Breckenridge was, as the locomotive was coming in, well, all those what appeared to be cans decorating the nose of the engine. In the conversation, she's told me to go something like this, that I asked her why they were there. And she said that she really doesn't care right now. She just wanted to get on the train. Remember, this is wartime and standing room only type trains, and find our seats. And the guy standing next by said that he was a railroad man and said, tell him, meaning me, that they're called air cans. And just by accident, recently I saw a picture of one of those locomotives, and I found that the official name is a pair of cross compound air pumps. So some of you steam experts may have a different term, but at least that's one that I found. Well, here's the same train going across, presumably the Montana prairies. Picture taken by Warren McGee, NP conductor, who there's a lot of excellent photography work, mostly on the NP, as you'd expect, but also some on the Great Northern. Well, one thing interesting to look at now is the difference of the NP and GN lines, where the line crosses the beach of historic Lake Agassiz, which I'll show you a map of in a minute here. But even in a place like this, where you think of it's in the Red River Valley, it's flat as a board, how could one line possibly have any advantage over the other? And amazingly, there was in the construction. So the grade is not a major factor. The elevation above sea level is, well, in the case of the Great Northern Line, it's at Breckenridge that I got that elevation. On the NP, it was at Dilworth. But then if you look at 32 miles east of the river, where you're getting out of the valley and up on the hills, such as they are, the NP has had to climb about 300 feet more not the biggest deal, but in the scheme days, it did amount to something. And in order to keep the grades to what they were, the NP put in 14 curves, and the Great Northern only put in 2 in those 32 miles. Here's what we mean by Lake Agassiz. Those of us who went to grade schools in Minnesota had this one drilled into us, so we'd never forget that. There are a lot of people nowadays who don't hear it anymore. And, you know, supposedly this is the light blue part was what the all the water that lay after the melting of the glaciers in the area 10 or 12,000 years ago. The darker blue are what remains of Lake Agassiz. There's still large lakes, but the main significance as far as the railroad goes is in about the lower center where you read the small print. It says beach ridges. That's where we're climbing out of the Red River Valley, and we'll talk about what the NP had to do to get a low grade route compared to what the GN had to do, which was virtually nothing, just a better spot. So in the case of the NP going east of Dilworth, which is their yard just east of Moorhead, 2 or 3 miles or east of the state line, they originally built at 0.75%, which in the diesel electric age is not anything to get too excited about, but it was in the steam days. And they wanted to reduce it to 0.3. And I'll show you a couple of pictures here of how they did that, building a trestle as high as 50 feet, then running work trains out on that trestle and dumping the dirt, either side dump cars or bottom dump cars, to form an embankment. And the trestle structure would stay there forever. It was, you know, insulated from the air, so at least for a long, long time, the wood would not deteriorate. The trestle that the NP built was 7.5 miles. Now keep in mind the Great Northern did not have to do these Herculean engineering projects. And in the case in the bottom point about curvature, the revised line was built with a curve of 1 degree 4 minutes. That's on the NP, and 1.5 miles in length to reduce the grade. That's a very long curve, even though it is a light curve. It's just not too far from Wally at the top of the grade, so to speak. So if you ever drive out on US Highway 10 west of Detroit Lakes toward Moorhead, you can see much of what we're talking about here, these huge embankments that they put in. So again, summarizing details about the characteristics of the NP line. Again, curvature we talk about throughout this slide here. But in addition to the curvature itself, soil conditions, sometimes called buffalo dirt and sometimes called gumbo, caused tremendous problems for the NP in being able to stabilize those fills till they finally could have the good railroad that they got by the 1920s. But they did put a huge amount of work and money in to get grades down to where the Great Northern was. And
Oh, we've lost your audio.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we hear you now.
Okay, go ahead.
anyway, we had the same problem here. We, meaning the State Highway Department, had to dig out a huge amount of this gumbo soil yet and backfill it with lake sand in order to establish a decent subgrade over which they poured concrete for a 4-lane highway. So the problem was still there even for the Minnesota Department long after the NP had corrected it. So I mentioned the structure a few minutes ago. Imagine all this wood having to be brought in from, I presume at that time, eastern Minnesota, Wisconsin, and probably even the state of Washington to build a structure like this. The track is the original line, still single track. But then NP built this double track line on that immense structure. And then here you see more of the structure being built, the wood part, and then also pouring this archway for horses and motor vehicles to be able to get through the fill. And there's still 3 of those, if I remember right, on that fill you can see from Highway 10. They're narrow and restricted clearance for trucks, unless they've been improved in recent years since I was there. Well, we'll move on to people. Tom Cottner, I mentioned earlier. Tom became an engineer after he got out of the war, out of World War II, that is. And he worked as an engineer on the Wilmer division. And as such, engineers based in St. Paul worked both the St. Cloud line as far as St. Cloud, and they worked the Wilmer line. After retiring from BN, Tom ran the Red River Valley and Western after it was short-lined out of a collection of NP and GN branches. And then later was president of another short line, Minnesota and Northern, which I believe runs between Crookston and War Road. So this is the age in which he came to work after the war. He told me he spent a lot of time studying on his own the characteristics of the diesel locomotive for road service, because he knew that was coming. And even before the railroad began to train people or think about what the transition was going to be, he made sure he was ready. Because here in this case, as a fireman, he was called one day, one of the first days this train ran with the E7 locomotives in about 1947. The engineer was based at St. Paul, but a Wilmer seniority. He said, "I don't like running these diesel engines, kid. Do you know how to run them?" He was 22 years old, but he'd been studying the books and doing some writing as a fireman. But he said, "Sure, I can run it." So he took it out. In those days, they didn't pay as much attention to speeds as they do now. So he took it up and got to Wilmer on time and surprised all the bosses that when they had this engineer refuse to run a diesel, here's this kid, 22 years old, ran it out there. Now, this has nothing to do with the railroad other than the name. When I was growing up, as I mentioned earlier, in Fergus Falls, there was an amateur baseball league in which Fergus Falls and Alexandria and Morris and Litchfield and Wilmer were in, and Wilmer had a team named the Rails. And we're putting together things of historical anecdotes for this talk. Just for the fun of it, I did a search for Wilmer Rails. Well, amazingly, I found a part where the fellow who had been manager of the Wilmer Rails back in the 50s, name was Lefty Ranweiler. He was still around until recently. And then this team was reestablished, and they still kept the name as Rails, which I thought was good, rather than call it something else in the modern day. Tom Lamphere became president of Burlington Northern of Transportation Division in the early 70s, and his heritage with the Great Northern and the Wilmer Division was that of roadmaster on the South Dakota lines not long after he had graduated from MIT as a civil engineer. While he was roadmaster out there, someone in the accounting department who was beginning to make the plans for the first UNIVAC computer started looking, who have we got that we could bring in, who's got the brain power to understand how to set up a computer system and work with the company that made UNIVAC at that time. And they said, well, we got this roadmaster out in Dakota, South Dakota, who has an MIT degree. Goodness, we need to start promoting him. Let's ask him if he'll come in. Lamphere was glad to come in, and he made a hit on that job and worked his way up to become president. Excellent technical man, one of the smartest I've been around. He was hard to work for, but he was a really sharp individual. And he kept himself updated on track standards and so on, even though what he had learned in his younger days was just the branch line work with the pick and shovel, you might say, and no real machinery. But he had kept up on all that. And he gave lectures once in a while, and he would talk about basic track work that he had learned as a young roadmaster on those branches. So here we have a picture on the right-hand side, Gary Nelson in his passenger uniform. And he's visiting here with an engineer who was active with the BNSF at this time, Steve Curtis. They were both called. Well, actually, Steve was called to work an employee appreciation day special, and Gary was along for the ride. Well, Gary's history is quite interesting. We've got 2 or 3 slides here of what he's done. He started out with the Great Northern not long before the merger, 67. He is a 3rd generation rail. His dad was an engineer at Wilmer. And he spent much of his career with a shift in business. I'll talk about this on another slide. He had to go to work on one of the allocations in the so-called Staples pool, running on the preferred route between Northtown and Staples on the old NP, following the work when trains were diverted from the GN to the NP after the merger. And in that time, he worked 20 years as conductor on Amtrak. He and then worked the Monticello local, which is part of the West Side line, the Osseo line, sometimes called. Retired in 2009. He won the Chairman Award in 1995. Of course, by this time we had the BNSF, or maybe just about the time we're going from the BN to BNSF. But here's his record in addition to railroad service. I mean, railroad service of running a train. I mean, it's quite impressive of what he did coming into the Twin Cities and coming into foreign territory, having to mix with all the NP guys on that Staples pool. Nothing easy about that culturally. So the GNRHS and many other organizations yet today are glad to have his service. Well, back to this issue about Wilmer people being cut off as train service people, engineers, conductors, and brakemen being cut off when the trains were diverted to the NP as the so-called preferred route between Minneapolis, Fargo, and Castleton. So Gary was in his 20s, moved to Minneapolis, and was one of the GN people who was involved in this collision of culture. And not easy. Well, not long after that, the company realized that, hey, on these GN guys, we got to have some of them that are qualified as conductors. And in the allocations, as they were called, within the Staples pool. So Gary was given only 10 days notice to prepare for his exam for promotion. And he passed the test. And then most of the NP employees in that chain gang were in the area of 50, at least the conductors, 25 years of service. And here you got this kid with about 4 years service coming in, and not even 30 years old. So that caused some cultural collision until everybody got used to everybody else and recognized finally we're all railroaders. And he's old, right or wrong, the NP and GN are gone, so let's start treating each other like professional railroad people that we are. And of course, at this time too, the passenger trains had been finally knocked off, so the NP had a lot of guys who no longer could work because the North Coast Limited and the Main Streeter and anything else was gone. So they had to, in most cases, the best job they could hold was in the chain gang. Well, here's an interesting guy, Peewee Erickson. He was a he was a short conductor who had good crop of red hair, lots of hair and curly, and he was one of the most jovial, enjoyable people you could ever be around. And I'd forgotten him for a long time until I'd worked with him before the merger. But there was in the Fergus Falls newspaper, there was a picture of number 28, on its last trip before Amtrak was coming into effect. And 28 was to be abolished forever. Anyhow, Peewee was the conductor, and the picture showed him with a big smile visiting with the passengers, and the article said they overheard him thanking people for making the last trip, and thanks for riding with us while you did all these years. And it's all gone. You won't see any more now. Won't see me now. I gotta go down to freight. But he was a terrific guy. And there's a story Gary Nelson told me about him that I'd never heard before until recently. And that is that when Tom Lanford, we talked about a few minutes ago, the roadmaster became president. Well, as president, once he was up on the fourth floor, the top floor of the Hump Tower at Northtown Yard in Minneapolis. And of course, anytime the president would come around, by railroad tradition, there's always a big entourage of the next 2-3 levels of management along with him, so they can all answer questions and take their turn of being chewed out if things aren't going well and whatever. So up on the top floor of this Hump Tower, you got Lanphier and 15 or 20 officers all dressed up in suits around him, and everybody's being quiet to listen to what questions is Lanphier asking and what are his answers and what are his responses and so on. Well, while this is going on, the elevator door opened up, and here's Peewee dressed up in coveralls coming off the elevator, and he's only 5 feet 5 inches, and he's worming his way through this crowd of officers, and none of them knew, should we grab him and kick him out of here, put him back in the elevator and cause a scene, or what should we do? Well, nobody could decide what to do, because by that time Peewee was already talking to Lanphier, and Lanphier remembered him well from when Peewee was a brakeman on locals running in South Dakota. That had been over the days they'd been out to unload ballast or ties or whatever the roadmaster needed. So they had a great jovial conversation and a hug, and of course that took all the tension out of the air right then and made it a pleasant day from then on. Peewee kind of saved the day right there when he came in as a freight conductor. Nope, I hit the wrong button. What I remember about Peewee was that when he was an extra board conductor, he'd be called. He could not reach up. If you remember how the coaches used to be on the train, you had a rack above the seats where people could put their hats and coats and suitcases and so on. And they had a little clip up there that the conductor would put a little red or white tag with a station number on. This is what your destination is. Well, Peewee couldn't reach those. So if there was a seat empty, he would stand on top of the seat to reach it. But often there was somebody in the seat, so that couldn't be done. So he'd always have to ask one of the passengers to do it for him or call the brakeman over, and always got kind of a laugh. And Peewee just made light of it. Just a great guy. Mike Martin. Some of you may know that Mike was a Great Northern officer at the positions shown on the left here. His dad was the head of the law department of the Burlington Railroad, and Mike went to the student officer program on the GN and advanced well. But he wrote an article, I think it was in the either in the GOTA, one of the reference sheets, about his experience in going out on snow removal duty on both the main line and on the South Dakota branches in the 1960s, and one of the worst storms in history. It's quite a good story if you haven't read it. Mike's been retired for quite a while now, lives in Texas. Bill Byrne, some of you may know, he was a conductor at Sioux City after the war. And when I say the war now, I'm talking about people of my age. We think of that's World War II, not one of the subsequent ones. Anyhow, he became division superintendent at several places during his career, one of which was Wilmer, but he had been a conductor on the Sioux City line also. Paul Rasmussen, the Rasmussen family is quite popular and well known in Wilmer. Paul hired out as a track worker and advanced very well. And his brother Charlie was the general manager for the Great Northern in Seattle. There still are some Rasmussens. I'm not sure they have the same name, but they're in Wilmer. I've heard about, but I'm not acquainted with any of them now. But anyhow, he was a real institution in his days on the Wilmer division. One of which was he was a master, considered the best person on the Burlington Northern system for knowing how to remove snow that was packed like concrete. You know, from we used to call it snort, combination of North Dakota dirt and snow get blown together so hard that you had to either get dynamite or a cat to loosen it up, even for a rotary to get it out. And when I was general manager in Chicago after the merger, why Paul was superintendent in Hannibal, Missouri. He said, well, why did you send him down there? There's no snow in Hannibal, Missouri. Well, there wasn't. But anyway, it was interesting about Paul. He was a very good track man, and he was good at training young roadmasters and gang foremen down there, where he had huge projects underway to improve the railroad for the coal business. So we were lucky to have Paul down there. And he was an interesting guy. I remember we stayed at a motel one time at Centralia, Illinois. And in the morning to check out at the front desk, why I tried to pay by credit card. And the lady at the desk said, we don't take credit cards. We aren't modernized yet. You got to have cash. Well, Paul Rasmussen was there. He typically carried $1,000 cash. I don't know why, but that he just did. Of course, this is 1975 or so. I suppose that's like carrying 5,000 today. But anyhow, he paid, and I followed up to make sure I paid him back. But Paul was an excellent man. Leroy Ekstrom, some of you may have known. He was he held jobs like an administrative officer, chief clerk for many years. So the superintendent in Wilmer, and then he moved to Minneapolis, and the superintendent's office was moved there. And I apologize for misspelling Wilmer for those of you who are from there. I did know better, but it didn't get spelled right. Anyway, Leroy was a great guy. He lived till about age 95 or so, and even after the merger, he retired not too many years after. He moved back to Wilmer, and he was given an office in the depot, as I recall, in the ground floor on the north end of the depot, or west end, I mean. And you'd have employees coming in who, in order to beat the system or not have to try to call someone in the general office for questions about benefits, how to do the retirement papers, dealing with the railroad retirement board and all that kind of stuff. He was an expert on that. He'd do it for them for nothing. So he was still doing the job even well after he retired. Mel Winter, I could not find a picture of Mel. Mel was from St. Cloud, but he hired out at Wilmer because they weren't hiring at St. Cloud at that time. So he became a brakeman and conductor. And he was a leader and was elected as general chairman of the entire system, representing Great Northern employees throughout the whole system. And after the merger, still representing the employees who worked on former GN lines, because they were still working under the old system of agreements that the GN had negotiated with the unions over the years. And Mel was a real institution. He was reelected for 30 years. He was not easy to deal with, and he went down in history for opposing the agreements that would provide for a reduced size crew, meaning fewer brakemen or no brakemen eventually on through freight trains. And he really fought that hard and made a lot of publicity over it. And finally, the union even had to intervene and, you might say, overrule to get something done, because every other railroad in the country had made that change except on BN and the former GM lines. And I believe on the SP&S also, because he represented the SP&S at the end. Anyhow, he was an institution, controversial, no matter what you think of him, he's one of the folks from Wilmer. This picture I found enjoyable in a book of history of Kandiyohi County. On one page was this picture of FT units, which must have been just almost brand new at this time in 1944. And I took a picture of the crew. And on the left is one of the Conways. Remember I mentioned a train master named Conway. And Gary Nelson told me that this engineer Conway was one of 5 brothers who worked for the railroad. 3 was locomotive engineers and 2 as conductors. And I don't know if there are any Conways still working or not, but anyhow, it was quite a record at that time. Anyway, in good of the Mona Nelson and her crew to put this picture in that book. David Plowden, I mentioned him as one of those I gave some credit to. He was a student officer and left sometime during that time, left the railroad, became a professional photographer, mostly of small town America and grain elevators and railroads within it. He published a book. I can't think what the title was now. If anybody's interested, let me know. I'll let you know what it is. But he published a book with a lot of his pictures. And there, I'll show you a few of them later on here too that were taken in the Wilmer area. But to me, the most interesting thing in that book that Plowden wrote was about a 10-page story of a trip that he made on the engine, on a Class P2 steam engine in 1956 between Wilmer and Minneapolis on 2nd 28. He was supposed to be, as a student officer, spending time with the night dispatching shift, midnight to 8 a.m. approximately group, and the yard people at the same time in the winter. But for whatever reason, there were 2 sections of 28 on this day, and they put a steam engine on, and the engineer got on, whose name was Brown, who was another institution, kind of like Mel Winter I told you about, except for the engineers. Anyhow, Brown was the engineer, and he was disgusted that there wasn't a diesel on it, and complete reversal of the other story I told you. So this fellow here, David Plowden, just without talking to his bosses first, he just got up and left the dispatcher's office where he's supposed to be learning something, and got on the engine and rode with Brown on 2nd 28 into St. Paul on that P2. And he describes this trip. And he said they're going through Litchfield at about 3 or 4 a.m. at 100 miles an hour. And if you drive into Litchfield, no matter what time of day it is, or any community that size, and you're trying to think of a train going through at 100 miles an hour, it's just a story that you wonder how did the railroads ever survive when they had this kind of performance going on. But Brown was convinced this would be the last time he could ever run an engine like that, and he was going to see how much it was really built for. So here's a locomotive built, I understand, in the 1920s. And here is 1956, and it was standby power at Minot for passenger service. I don't imagine anybody ever envisioned having to use it, but they only did. But going through 100 miles an hour through Litchfield, unbelievable to me. Well, here's a series of pictures. We all collect things that are of particular interest to us. Some of these will be easily recognized and old stuff for you, but still, I'll go through quickly. The Stone Arch Bridge. I like this one because it's part of the Wilmer division, but also it's on James J. Hill's pride and joy, getting that Stone Arch Bridge built. But what I find most interesting is here's a bridge that was built in the 1880s, I believe. And here in about 1970s, here's a coal train coming over there, 14,000 tons of coal and cars and 4 locomotives, each weighing about 200 tons. And you think that this bridge, it's like the pyramids in Egypt, they'll last forever. And it's amazing. You could do things. You could do things like that. So we could use this bridge. This is after the passenger service is gone, of course. You could use this bridge and go through the depot area as long as you had no cars higher than a standard boxcar because of the canopy over the tracks to protect the passengers. But engineering department gave us the okay for these loaded coal trains. And at that time, before many other improvements were made in the Twin Cities, it was the easiest way to run a through freight train through St. Paul and Minneapolis was to go over that bridge and use the passenger route. And even with a grade of 1.6% in St. Paul, just before you reach 3rd Street and the old depot. This picture was taken by Gary Nelson's dad, who I told you was a locomotive engineer at Wilmer. This is the first trip west of GP9s in the 700 series that had some interesting characteristics. They were equipped with dynamic brake, and I presume that must be they were the first Jeeps that dynamic brake was put on the Great Northern. They're equipped with the same snowplow, and at that time, they still were identifying extra trains with the white flags. And the bell looks like a brass bell, nicely shined up, first trip. And then, but these units were headed out west to be used on the mountain grades of Montana and Washington. So these units were bought not long before those GP20s on my first picture one. Well, this one, if you just know anything about Great Northern passenger trains, you know that 32 and 14 should not be in Romer at the same time. But they were on this day. But when you look at the conditions around there, you can understand why they were running late. At Minneapolis Junction, a big wrecking crane was based, and I put that in here because if there was a need to move this wrecker out on the Wilmer line or west of there, even west of the Wilmer division, the chain gang crews that were laying over in Minneapolis Junction awaiting a westbound train, they would be called to send that out. Of course, it was going up the Wasabi division. You'd get a crew from Superior to run it, handle it. But I thought it was interesting. The oil company made this ad, said that they had a special fluid, starts the crane instantly, even at 50 below. So it's meeting your customers' needs. There's some characteristics of the Great Northern Railway that I respected and enjoyed the most were the condition of its property, including small buildings like this. And I already showed you the yard in Wilmer, which as I recall today, which as I recall was just as clean and good 50, 60 years ago, maybe 100 years ago as it was in that picture. Anyhow, back to this picture. This is a group of small pictures that small structures that I took a picture of myself in the 1960s. They're all between Wilmer and Breckenridge. I think that some of you who know that line better than I do may find one that I'm wrong on, but I think but at least they're representative of what you find on a Great Northern most any place, including the Wilmer division, both main lines and branch lines. So here's, for example, is a depot at Kirkhoven, and it's been somewhat modernized, good-looking sign, it's clean. Doesn't have too many flowers and shrubs like some do, we'll see later here, but most of these buildings now are gone. Agencies were taken out long ago, and the only ones left are those used by signal maintainers and section crews to store material at their on duty points. You never found buildings like this on any other railroad. Most of them were badly in need of paint. There's junk around, weeds growing up all over the place, old scrap material scattered around, tripping hazards all over the place. And the Great Northern, starting with Mr. Budd on down, I've been told, just insisted we're going to look like a credible, up-to-date organization and not a junkyard. So again, you don't see too many of these buildings around anymore. The BNSF, in my opinion, doesn't do a good job of maintaining the ones that they have, but we're talking about history or not today. But as I said, you don't find, even on other railroads that were well off, like the Union Pacific and the Santa Fe, you didn't find small buildings like this. And you say, what does that do for the bottom line? Nothing, really. Might save some injuries, but it's it's an indication of pride. And in some cases, you'd find that little buildings like this were among the best looking in some of these small towns. Well, this one here now, you can say, what in the world is this picture in here for? It's at Howard Lake. I've always wondered why someone never got in a boat and took a picture of a train going around that curve. It really is quite a nice sight there. Anyhow, this picture happened to, I picked up on the internet somewhere. It's 2 Norfolk Southern units equalizing miles. So, there's nothing more profound than that. We talked about David Plowden a minute ago. This picture, contrary to what I said, not all of them that I'm going to show here are in the Wilmer area. This one was taken somewhere west of Havre, between Havre and Shelby, I guess. And almost everybody I've ever shown this picture to who doesn't work for the railroad say, oh, you got one car is empty. How can that be? How did that ever happen? So I guess a good title for this picture really is The Empty. But this picture was used in quite a lot of advertising by railroad supply companies. Picture of near Atwater, 3377, I believe. Is that the type? It's called an 05 that were 08, the most powerful steam locomotive there was for the other than the articulated locomotives used in mountains and for ore. Good picture. So Plowden was supposed to be learning how to become an assistant train master, and he's out doing things like this and riding second 28 or 100 miles an hour through Litchfield. This one here, there's a snow fence up. I don't know if that snow fence is still there, if the railroad may have graded that cutback to avoid drifting in that cut or not, so they don't have to have a snow fence. I wouldn't be surprised that snow fence is gone now. There's the same train you see on one track there. The flanger has been through and broken up the hard packed snow and ice between the rails so that the track people can get a better look at the joints primarily. And the other track closest to us has not yet had a flanger over it after the last recent snowfall. Well, I'm going to close here now by talking about things that are more closer to today. What's the Wilmer Division all about today? This is the Wilmer Y project. Now, those of you who were here last week, and I understand we're on a bus trip in which this project was described. And the red line is to be a new connection. The benefit to the railroad is that if you have a train coming from, let's say, Grand Forks or Minot down here, you don't have to, and it's supposed to go to Sioux City, you don't have to go into the yard at Wilmer, take up one track to yard it and another to get the engine back and around to the other end and then start down here again, all of which can take time and block city streets, crossings and so on. And from the point of view of the city of Wilmer, its taxpayers' way, there's a chance to, in that property, in that triangle, to locate some industries that need rail transportation or trucks and can pay taxes and provide provide jobs. Well, this is a big job. I understand from Mark Jevery, the project engineer in charge, that it'll be done in 2022. So here's, we've already talked about these things, so we don't have to say it again. Now, other things that are interesting that are going on, or that have gone on, are the Staples subdivision, which of course is former MP. What has been done on that line to make it even better than it was as a largely double track railroad before merger? Well, they built a new bridge over the Mississippi in Little Falls, and unfortunately did not make it a double track bridge, but in any event, a new bridge. And then the second point, and I think is very interesting, that where the NP had all but 30 miles of double track, they, meaning the BN and BNSF primarily, put in signaling on both tracks in both directions, along with power switches and their crossovers, and greatly increased the capacity and the flexibility on that railroad. This is a major improvement. But at the time of the merger plan was put together, there probably were only 20 trains a day or so on this line combined with GN and NP. But before the coal began to decline a couple of years ago, 60 or 70 trains a day was not uncommon. So anybody who said the railroads were going out of business and all that they were totally wrong. We've got some setback now, but hopefully some new kinds of business will be developed also. So we don't have to see this double track reduced to single track, things like that. And, the last point here was a big mistake that was made by BN, in which between Big Lake and Becker on the former NP, the 112-pound rail was due for relay. And at that time, I won't go into all the details, but we had a management in place that had no faith in the future of the railroad. And the decision was made to reduce it to single track, which was, you ask any conductor or engineer who worked on that line what a headache that produced, capacity-wise, and congestion and delays and whatever. It was terrible, but anyhow, that was restored now to double track under the BNSF, a real plus. And we haven't got time to go into all the improvements that were built in to handle the North Star commuter service, but many of those improvements were also beneficial to the railroad's freight service. They still haven't finished converting the single track between approximately Little Falls and Staples to double track, but there's been some work done toward it, and hopefully someday that'll get done. Although right now, again, with the coal business going away, it may be a long time before that comes about, if ever. Now, this is some comparison here between 2009. The reason I had picked 2009 was that that was the last year that BNSF was generous to the public with this kind of data. They shut it off for some reason after that point. So unless you have some particular insight and want to risk somebody's job by asking them for it, why it's hard to get new data on things like this. But anyway, if you look at the first line, before merger, the tonnage on the Minneapolis-Wilmer segment was 18 million gross tons. That's a combined weight of the freight, of course, and the cars. And in 2009, that had increased to 26 million. So even though the priority trains were diverted to the NP as the preferred route, was still the coal and the oil increasing, coming off the Sioux City line and on into the Twin Cities, actually increased the volume. That third column I made this slide a little confusing. I wish I'd split it into two, but anyway, that third column with the 13 trains, that's the average number of trains in 2009, daily trains. And the second line, Wilmer Breckenridge gross tonnage 17 million before merger. And these are numbers that were part of the merger study. And then that it stayed just even by 2009. I don't know what it is today with the increase in the oil and the ethanol and much more grain moving. Because those numbers are not made public by BN, as I've said a couple of times. Now the big change is the third line, the Sioux City line. 4 million before the merger. That's before, of course, the Sioux City line or bridge was built. The new bridge could handle heavier loads and more traffic. But now that tonnage had increased to 24 million by 2009 and 12 trains a day average. Now these averages are crude. You can find days that probably have 18 and you find someone that's 10. But now down the bottom here, the third line, I made a mistake. Number of crews in 1969. It should have said 8 worked west and 8 worked east out of Wilmer. I missed the number 8 there somehow. I didn't even see it until yesterday when I was going through this again. And now today, there's a combined pool that works both directions out of Wilmer, not east and west separate, but both ways, of 18 crews. So it's pretty close to the same, 16 and 18. So even though the trains aren't as classy, let's say, with coal and ethanol and oil as they are with UPS business and containers for Best Buy, and so it's not quite the same business. Still, in terms of number of people in train service, it's not taking a hit, about the same. In 1968, some interesting things happened in the executive suite of the Great Northern. There was some concern that after the merger was turned down by courts in that year, that we may have to go it alone. Now, how do we get ready for the future? Now, one thing was to reorganize the marketing department to get a stronger sales and service effort. But another one was that affected the Wilmer division was to build some new facilities, primarily in the Twin Cities, but also one in Seattle I'll talk about here. So these buildings, before the Northtown Yard was done, these new buildings were very nice to have, although, railroad facilities when they're built, they're supposed to last kind of like the pyramids forever. But if these facilities here listed are finished in about 1968 or 69. And then it was of 1975 when the Northtown Yard was finally finished that had the same kind of capability built into it. And after that point, this capability at Minneapolis Junction wasn't needed as badly. But in any event, with the idea, we may have to go it alone. Plus, you could say, until Northtown Yard is done or opened up by the mid-70s, we're going to need some help in the Twin Cities. So we're lucky that we had these facilities on Great Northern property, even though the property they were on was off the main route, so to speak. So I'll show you pictures of these here in just a second. And the last point, in addition to major projects in the Twin City, in Minneapolis Union Yard area, we also had a big project at the locomotive shop in Havre and a new car repair shop in Seattle. Anyway, here's a Minneapolis Junction, this new servicing and inspection shop with a roof over it, an elevated track, which you could get, I believe, 4 units inside at one time, and you could get out of the bad weather for servicing, and they had the best equipment available to support sanding and fueling and inspection, wheel change out, and so on for locomotives. Fortunate to have this facility. This facility now, I understand, is used by the same group that has the former Milwaukee steam engine. But before that too, when we finished the big diesel shop on the former NP at Northtown Way, the C&W had this facility for a while. Then after all of their mergers and whatever, they pulled out, and that's when the Milwaukee 261 group moved in. Then this tower now was new, in one of those, in case we have to grow alone things, to replace one-story frame buildings to give a better view to the yard masters and the other supervisors. Just a much better facilities for the railroad officers to conduct their business from. And then this car shop was built. This was later on converted to a maintenance away shop after the merger. It's called Bridalveil, named for a creek which flows underneath the yard at this point. And I don't know where that name comes from, but in any event, it was an excellent facility to have, even though we had to haul van order cars from the NP yard about 3 miles down or 4 miles down here to get them repaired, because this was an excellent facility before the Northtown facility was done after merger in the mid-70s. To change gears here, another thing that's happened since in more modern times is these green lines are, this is a map put out by the South Dakota Department of Transportation state. Any of the green lines are those now that the BN and BNSF acquired that were former Milwaukee lines, including across the top, the main line, but also you have this group of branch lines here that was the so-called core system. And these are lines that were not in very good shape under the Milwaukee, as you'd expect, but they were taken over by the BN in a cooperative deal with the Governor Janklow and the legislature in South Dakota. And there's even a large number of very large grain elevators built on some of these lines now that produce grain that moves on the Milwaukee main or on the Sioux City line, depending on where it's the old GN Sioux City line, depending on where the destination is. And what made a big difference, as I mentioned a minute ago, on the Sioux City line was getting a high capacity bridge put in. The old bridge on the left had been used under tractor's rights from the C&W who owned the bridge. And it was only good for GP 7 level and GP 9 locomotives. You could not run the heavier, newer locomotives on there, and you could not run 100-ton loads on that bridge. But anyhow, after the merger and the coal was coming along and the unit grain train rates were put in for unit trains to the West Coast for export, why there was no reason why the BN would delay replacing the old bridge. So you see it under the new bridge under construction on the right here. Here's the grand opening, the first official train over, and the old C&W bridge has not been torn down yet. And the bridge was opened in '82. And at the same time that this happened, BN put in some huge projects to upgrade the Sioux City line, the entire distance between Wilmer and Sioux City. And that's been a real winner of a project, having that built into a high-class main line, although it does not have CTC, but it does have, of course, have positive train control. And even with the long crew district of over 200 miles between Sioux City and Wilmer, why still can handle a lot of trains over there now. But this is a real marketing plus here, was getting that Sioux City line fixed up. It could not be justified under the Great Northern, where you still had the old bridge. And the old bridge was really a CB&Q asset, you might say, because they're the ones who had the contract with the C&W to use the old one. And the C&W only used that line, that bridge, for branch line service. And it, of course, as we all know, it was not in good shape financially, so you could not expect that they were ever going to do anything there. So part of the deal was, in acquiring the old bridge, we would scrap it and sell the value of this scrap steel for ourselves, and that they would be able to use it twice a day to go over to those few industries they had on the Nebraska side of the bridge. The red dots here are what I intend here to show, and that is this concentration of grain shuttle elevators, sometimes called rapid grain loading facilities. And notice the big concentration that there is in the eastern North Dakota and South Dakota and southwestern Minnesota, all these served by the Twin Cities division of today's railroad, but largely of the old Wilmer division. So this has been a real, this is real good example of cooperative efforts with the grain, the international grain trade to develop markets in the Pacific Rim to export all of this grain. And it's probably the best, overall, the best business that the company has. And this rapid grain loading, shuttle grain loading 110 or 125 cars. Notice those red dots. Now you see some in Illinois, there's some in Kansas, Oklahoma, even in Texas. So the whole concept of this low cost grain transportation to export facilities, largely on the West Coast, has been a real winner, and the people of the Wilmer division have definitely will always benefit greatly from that. Well, this picture here is not on the Wilmer division, but I picked it up because whichever way you're going, away from us or to us, you're going to have to go through a switch to tie up. And so enough is enough here. I'll stop here. So we'll tie up and go eat or whatever it is that we want to do next. So thank you. I enjoyed putting together this presentation.
Well,
Okay.
thank you very much. That was very interesting.
Hey, Tom, I'll stop screen sharing.
All right. Do we have any questions for Earl?
There's nothing in the chat.
No.
You're good.
Yeah. Yeah, that
Well,
that was
I'd
a
like-
wonderful presentation. Go ahead, Norm.
Well,
I'd just
thank
like
you,
to
Norm.
thank Earl for a great presentation.
Mhm.
Well, thank you, Norm. Coming from you, I really appreciate that. Thank you. Norm is a Mr. Wilmer division of today.
Mhm.
Most more about than anybody.
Yeah.
Well, if there are no questions, I'll say again, thank you very much, Earl. Very much appreciated.
Yes, thank you.
We will go into our lunch break, and at this time, I'll stop the recording.